back in their seats. This is now the last panel, and it actually looks like we've got a full house again. So this one is an important one because if anything defines a hybrid warfare, information is that element. Memory wars, information wars, deception, versions, and so on and so forth. And I think this one would have, we loaded it up in some ways because it had so many different dimensions. One of those dimensions, Luka Haida, would have done memory wars in a pretty extensive way, because that's happening now. The Russians keep claiming that the Ukrainians are inventing their history. Unfortunately, he fell ill and was not able to make it. So, but on the other hand, James is going to introduce at some point at the end of this panel, you're going to introduce our women warriors to say a few words.
Well, why don't we introduce them now, and then they can make a comment at the end. That might
Okay.
be
Yeah. Would you? Yeah.
Sure.
And so actually what I'll do is I'll hand it over to the competent hands of James, and James will run the session and do it whichever way he wants to. James, it's all yours.
Great.
All right, thank you.
It's great being back at the sessions here and thinking about Ukraine and mature statehood. I'm delighted, just before we get started, that we have some special guests here visiting from Ukraine and from New York. Luba Shipovich called me yesterday, and Razum called me and said we have a group of women veterans who are visiting here and are looking and increasingly active in veterans diplomacy. If I can just maybe ask each of you to stand. Maria Berlinska here, and Yulia Mytykenko, sorry. And Katarina Lutzig. Yeah. And the ladies are veterans, a real phenomena. Ukraine has had women in the services for many years, but the real mobilization to save the country in 2014 brought in tremendous numbers of patriotic young people and many, many women, and they're representative of this wave, and they're not only have made their contributions, but also have, I think, established a new trends and new real capabilities and new social phenomena in Ukraine that are very, very positive for Ukraine, for the Ukrainian armed forces. I've asked them to, when we're done here, to have a minute and just react from the front on information and in their sense. So they'll be the first responders. 10 years ago, roughly, I can remember coming to one of these and speaking about a project that had recently been done by the Ukrainian national security community, working in civil society. It was a time when the presidency and the prime minister were in conflict. Russia had just invaded Georgia. Ukraine was having a very hard time coming to grips with what that meant. And so the security community inside and outside of government came together to look at national security, to look at security policy. And I remember very strongly the two key conclusions. The first one was that the top threat to Ukraine's national security was internal weakness. The second was the top external threat was exploitation by Russia of Ukraine's internal weakness. And that, in fact, this situation, for example, of being in the gray zone, was to a substantial extent because there were plenty of people in Ukraine's elites in particular who felt very comfortable there. And that inability, that internal weakness, that internal sense of maybe the current interests versus the possible vision made opportunities. And the exploitation of those opportunities has really been the core and the key to what we've seen in information warfare from Russia. This was just 2 months after the Russian-Georgia war, when Russia showed its long-term capability, its strategic intent and action on the area of information, the aggressive use of alternate narratives to confuse things, especially with Western media and governments, cyber attacks to reduce the capability for governments to gather information, process it, and use it, and active measures to get inside government decision-making and influence it negatively. We can all remember the decisions that the Georgian leadership made in early August of 2008, which got things moving in the wrong direction, which played into Russia's hands. Those decisions weren't accidents. There were people in the Russian system modeling decision-making within the Georgian system and providing information into that to get reflexive responses. As the Russians would say, reflexive правление. And this was only the first wave. Russia has adapted the doctrine to new environments, the increasing tempo and flow of information that we see, the circumventing of traditional moderators in the information space, the challenge we all have of time to analyze information and to understand where it's coming from, the changing business model of media driven by clicks and advertising that's conglomerated in different ways, the access and analysis of consumer data that's available to be able to target advertising and voter data, the penetration by Russia of IT ecosystems, their development of cyber attack tools, most recently NotPetya, for example, in 2017. And all of these are continuing developments in Russian capabilities and in Russian effort in the information space that go back decades, that go back to the manipulation of history in Soviet times, for example. The use of modern technologies to achieve old purposes. And it's not just Russia today. It's China, it's North Korea, it's Turkey. Sorry, it's Iran. Turkey actually can be a player in this field as well, although fortunately in a NATO member still, although playing an unclear role in some cases. So there are big challenges out there. There also are positives. Russia has done some technically tough things, but it's really the weaknesses that they've been exploiting. They didn't create the weaknesses in the dynamics within the Democratic National Committee in 2016 that allowed them to that allowed the release of data to be so damaging. That was an internal weakness. There's substantial progress in uncovering and countering Russia's actions by people here today, Marko Suprun, Donald Jensen, two leading practitioners and experts in this field. Their successes: Ukraine successfully protected its election system, which has given this year, which has given a tremendous boost in political capital in the country. And we see politicians that are in Ukraine, the current president, politicians that are increasingly able to work in this field. So there's positive news in this hybrid environment. It's not all the Russians are coming and defeating us on every front. And there are capabilities that are being developed. And this Lysenko is an example of the young talent that's developing those kinds of capabilities. So as we look at our fantastic panel here today, Donald Jensen, the editor-in-chief and senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, a longtime expert on Russian foreign policy and disinformation. Welcome. Marko Suprun, a well-known civic activist in Ukraine, and with Patriot Defense and Stop Fake, most famously. We're sorry Zaryckyj is not here. But Sofia Lysenko, an award-winning break-in star in developing technical solutions for social entrepreneurship, including recently blockchain voting and deepfake detection, and a first-place win at PennApps Hackathon. couple thoughts as we sort of move ahead. The first is, as we look to countering, it's not just about countering actions, about building integrity. What can we do to create a dynamic that people can believe in? How can we move from episodic activities, from good things that are happening that each of you represent, to a more systemic approach, and one that blends both the focus of government and the initiative of the private sector? How do we as governments and as societies invest time and resources over the longer run to build capability? And then finally, how do we leverage Ukraine's experience for the rest of us? So with those thoughts up in the air, let me pass the floor over to Mr. Jensen.
Well, thank you. I haven't seen Jim in about 10 years. Great to see you again. And thank you for inviting me. And thank you to all of you in this room, especially to our veterans. Thank you for your service. If you look to your left and your right, your front and your back, you will, I think, recognize and appreciate the service all of the people in this room have done for Ukraine. As some of you who are visiting Washington may have noticed, or Brussels or Berlin, the information battle, the influence battle is by no means won over Ukraine and its future, so we have to keep up the fight, remain vigilant, and for that reason I want to express my appreciation for the role that everybody plays in this room. Given the very limited time we have, I wanted to say a little bit about Russia's information operations in Ukraine and put it in sort of a broader context. I think Jim is absolutely right. You have to realize Russia's information, let's call it influence operations against Ukraine is really a central, but by no means the only thread in Russia's attempt to use this kind of approach to warfare throughout Europe and the world. Ukraine is the test bed, but Ukraine is by no means unique. And the Russians even have a doctrine about it. Some people call it, although the Russians do not, hybrid warfare, but it really is a broad spectrum of information operations and other influence operations that range from what they say kinetic warfare, I hate that term, to money, to religious institutions, to bribery, to use of criminal groups, to information, to money, to business, to the security services. Russia targets individual countries, most especially, but not only Ukraine. Russia usually picks the weapons available that it thinks will be most effective, and again, Ukraine is the test bed. And sometimes it does not work, the attempted coup in Montenegro. Sometimes it does work, and most frustratingly, in many instances, it's a gray, continuing conflict with not a clear victor or loser, and that, unfortunately, is probably the status in which we could put Ukraine. The information influence campaign that Russia has, and I'm very glad that Jim brought up the Georgian War. This is a process that began well before Maidan, and it's a process that is likely to continue, and it's constantly changing, evolving, and adapting to new circumstances. And one of the difficulties you see in the U.S. response to the 2016 presidential influence intervention was that we're still focused on 2016, and Russia has moved on. Russia deals with Ukraine in new, ever-changing ways. They monitor developments in Ukraine very closely. And again, that's not true only of Ukraine, but most characteristically of Ukraine. Russia's foreign policy in general on information warfare has a few classic narratives. The non-interference in Russia's internal affairs, the whataboutism, we do this, but after all, you invaded Iraq. We do this, but after all, you guys are corrupt too. You hear this again and again and again. It often tars critics, including in my own organization. And by the way, SIPA spends a great deal of time on Ukraine as Russophobes, or it'll talk about the fraternal links between all Slavic peoples, Russia's special responsibility to protect not just the Russians in Donbass, but Russians everywhere, or Slavs everywhere, and it never ends, and you're probably all sick of it. I don't have to explain again what that's involved. Particularly, the focus of its attention, of course, is the United States, which it sees as a major drag on Russia's rightful rule in the world, and it seeks to undermine the West, undermine NATO, through the fomenting not necessarily of an alternative point of view, like it did during the Soviet era, but just to cause trouble, to cause chaos. It's enough for the Kremlin, and must have a lot of laughs lately, to stimulate, cause, be a party to the undermining of Western institutions, the undermining of Ukraine as a sovereign democracy, and you get the picture. So this is a constant battle that goes on, and those of us who pay attention to that, this, even during baseball playoff season, find it a constant challenge. On Ukraine itself, I wanted to go over a few themes, and I'm speaking to the choir here, about how it's covered events in your country since Maidan. First, the disinformation efforts started as soon as the Maidan protests became serious. The GRU, you've heard of them, I think, created fake accounts on VKontakte just after Yanukovych was ousted. The FSB took control of the VK servers. They then infiltrated the advertising in the country, the news media in the country, and of course, most famously and colorfully, the trolling in various media accounts in the country. The young man here says 10 minutes, so I'll bypass the examples, but you all know what I'm talking about. The goal is to exploit divisions and anxieties, and you've heard it all before. Ukraine is fascist, Ukraine is anti-Semitic, Ukraine discriminates against native Russian speakers, Ukraine discriminates against the residents of the Donbass, and so forth and so forth. Ukraine is hopelessly corrupt, and if you look at the rankings, it's less corrupt than Russia, but we all know the problem, and we're all trying to work with it. And this has a very pernicious impact on the perception of Ukraine and its authorities, not only in the country, not only in Europe toward Ukraine, not only in Donbass and Lugansk toward Ukraine, but also especially in Washington toward Ukraine. And it's a constant danger, and as I said, it's a constant struggle. We'll talk a little bit about the impact in the 5 minutes I have left. But I wanted to say a few words about the coverage of the Ukrainian elections, because it's been very interesting. And that's recalled in a very good article here that you might take a look at. Ukraine saw this spring's elections, both presidential and in the parliament, as an example of the illegitimacy of the Ukrainian state, that it's not a real democracy, that it's a puppet of the United States, that it's hopelessly corrupt, and so forth and so forth. And if you don't believe me, you can go on to Channel 1's Russia cable feed in Alexandria, which I often watch at home, and you'll see the hysterical attack on Ukraine. It ranges from the tasteless, and as you know, the remarks of official Russian media are often extremely racist, patronizing, and frankly, disgusting, to a general excitation that anything going on in Ukraine, even fights in the Rada, are really an example of Ukraine as a failed state. And this is a problem because obviously, I think not coincidentally, the size of the demonstrations in Moscow in July and August, I personally think we're partly a feedback of the Russians seeing that Ukraine is on its way to being a multi-party, pluralistic democracy. But Russia cannot stand that, and Russia thus exploits that on a daily basis, often in talk shows. I highly recommend you take your medication before then to take a look. But as an example of how the media reflects the official line, the treatment of Zelensky has been actually relatively mild compared to the treatment of Zelensky is treated with some sympathy in public statements, even if Ukraine is a puppet of the U.S. and a failed state. They tend to, I think, vest some hope that the Donbass-Steinmeier peace discussions in the last few weeks will result in a settlement to Russia's favor. And I'd be under no doubt that Russia has not abandoned its strategic goals of keeping Ukraine in its sphere of influence. But the people I know who saw Putin was last week at Valdai also said that Putin was extremely soft compared to previous discussions that occurred about Zelensky over dinner at Valdai. Nice young man. The fact that Lukashenko said this a day or two later is interesting, because Lukashenko also praised Zelensky as a fine young man. And this is obviously a trap, and you have to be very careful of it. It was Lavrov who privately blasted Zelensky at Valdai last week. So Putin has a tactical line, which is now, I think, trying to explore the possibility of negotiations. The information strategy of the Kremlin clearly reflects that, and they're making distinctions between the U.S. and Ukraine. They are hopeful that the Macron unfortunate comments recently will lead to a peace settlement that will end the sanctions and get Russian influence over the Donbass formalized, and that's really what they want to say. So, what's my point here? The point is that Russia's influence and information strategies very clearly, demonstrably, and unquestionably reflect the Kremlin policy line. There are a very large number of vulnerabilities. James mentioned some already. I would mention just a few others, especially the Russian-speaking population in the East. I think if you look at the election returns, even without most of those people voting, the relatively high percentage of the Boyko and Vichuk wing of the pro-Kremlin spectrum is a little bit troublingly high. I believe it was 12 or 13% for Boyko. But if those people voted, you can be sure Russia will finance anti-Kiev Russian political movements there. They have done that already, and the Ukrainians I've talked to, official Ukrainians, have said that Russia's information capacity has, in fact, had an effect on the Russian-speaking population of Donbass. The closer you get to the front, the more anxious they are for a Steinmeier-type formula. And again, the Steinmeier formula is a trap, and it's good, I think, that the President Zelensky walked it back a little bit on Friday, because I don't think in the long term, with the advice of supporters of Ukraine like us, it's going to get very far. I have 2 minutes left, I think. And the key of all Russian information discussions, I think, is not what are the narratives, it's do anybody believe the narratives? It's impact. In that sense, there's both good and bad news. I think Ukraine's tremendous vitality, the civil service, the street level NGO activity, the excellent performance of the Ukrainian military, and so forth, have all been surprises to the Kremlin. And so they constantly adjust their media strategies to take that into account. I know, in fact, a good friend of mine used to be an advisor to Putin before she came to the United States, and she said Putin just thought you could buy anybody like Yanukovych, you could manipulate anybody like Yanukovych, and he was completely surprised by the Maidan resistance. And they've been scrambling ever since. So let me give you some of the downside, because I think it's important to keep in mind. I think the fact that before 2014, many Westerners, especially in Washington, as my friend Ed Chow says, this town, knew very little about Ukraine, has planted ideas and perceptions in the minds of Western observers of Ukraine, including in influential positions here, that are really damaging to Ukraine. You still have the Russian-sponsored proxies in the East called separatists. And they're not separatists, they are bandits.
Yes.
But you and me and everybody in this room will go to these fancy lunches around Washington. You'll hear the word all the time. Second, they'll talk about anti-Semitism in the country. And of course, it's hard to argue that now after you have a Jewish president who's and Ukraine's Jewish community has not complained at all. Third, you hear the talk about banderovцы and fascism, and this is a very clear effort by Russia to take a concern in Ukraine's historical past. No one denies what happened, but they're twisting the context to advance a Kremlin foreign policy goal. It has to be constantly thought. And I could go on. The issue of language, East and West, and Russian versus Ukrainian speakers, that's a non-issue until the Kremlin made it an issue. So these traps are out there. These perceptions about Ukraine are still in people's minds here in Washington, as they are in Brussels, as they are in Berlin, and that means Paris. That means that all of us here today on the panel and out here have to keep up the fight, because in the end, it's the right cause, and in the end.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Marko, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm kind of glad I went the way I went, because the bird's eye view was well presented. Mine's a little bit more getting, well, it's the swamp, right? So let's get dirty and be in the swamp. Stop Fake. I've got to do this left-handed and right-handed. Stop Fake was founded about 5 years ago at the Kiev-Mohyla University School of Journalism, and its NGO, the Media Reform Center. It was founded by Ruslan Denichenko, Eugene Fedchenko, Marko Hontar, Yuri Panin, and the idea woman behind the English Language Digest is and remains Irina Chalupa, Oskar Krushenitsky's better half. We do fact-checking, obviously. We do media literacy workshops, and our priorities are in identifying and refuting fake information about events in Ukraine, training on fighting anti-democratic propaganda, and disinformation trainings on fact-checking and information verification for university students, bloggers, journalists, and civil society activists all around Ukraine. We do media literacy and media research. It was launched on March the 2nd, 2014, largely as a fact-checking site and in response to the invasion of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. It includes now, more journalists have joined the initiative, IT specialists, which is a critical component regarding cyber attacks, IT specialists, editors, translators, who cared about the truth about events in Ukraine. They joined the project, and at one point it grew to be about 11 languages. It's a credible and trustworthy fact-checking project. Again, primary goal is to verify information, raise media literacy, and establish a clear red line between factual journalism and propaganda. The activity of the Stop Fake team was the first to prove Russian propaganda is a systemic approach, which I think was clearly been presented, of the Russian government. We not only refute fakes, but we also created a propaganda archive and database that analyzes information and speaks about propaganda, the propaganda problem at conferences and seminars in Ukraine and abroad. For example, right now, Yevhen Fedchenko, the director of the School of Journalism, is in Sweden doing almost the same presentation. So we can act hybridly just as well as the Russians can. But besides propaganda in Ukraine, we also investigate the ways it influences other countries and regions, from Syria to Turkey to the European Union and other countries. Now, having said all of that, let's look at one example. Earlier this year, on May the 13th, the Groner Amsterdammer, a magazine based out of the Netherlands, reported that the St. Petersburg-based Internet Research Agency, also known as the Russian Troll Factory that everyone knows about, posted 65,000 tweets in 2 days following the downing of MH17. Now, an international consortium has already concluded that the airplane was shot down by a Russian Buk missile over eastern Ukraine on July 17, 2014, killing everyone on board. 65,000 tweets in 2 days. Using open source and other data, the joint investigation team that includes Ukraine, Amsterdam, the Netherlands, Thailand, and I think the Americans are on there, as well as the citizen journalist group Bellingcat, established clearly that the Buk missile system came from Russia, illegally crossed the Ukrainian border. That's the language they use today. Now, illegally crossing the border is today the euphemism of choice for invasion, especially when it comes to reports prepared by international organizations and some government agencies about Russian military vehicles, equipment, and personnel occupying Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula and the Donbass. Bellingcat has written several reports that detail where the Buk missile came from, what unit it was part of, and even the drivers who helped transport it to Ukraine. Now, the Dutch journalists at the Groene Amsterdammer analyzed tweets posted by the St. Petersburg trolls that included the hashtag cave shot Boeing down and the hashtag cave provocation that were posted and reposted over 40,000 times in the hours immediately after the plane was shot down, and another 24,000 times the following day. After July 19, 2014, the number of tweets fell dramatically, but in just over 2 days, 65,000 tweets were posted. So, these two hashtags, with the additional accompanying text, appeared 65,000 times over 2 days. So what's 65,000 tweets? Seems big, right? Can anybody tell me what it represents? No, you can't. I couldn't. I decided to count. One tweet in 2014 was 140 characters. Oh, I'm sorry, you guys are behind. One tweet is 140 characters. That's about 9,100,000 characters. According to Google and some university literature professors that we checked with, there's about 4 to 5 characters on average per written word. 2,000 characters is about 450 words. Just remember that. So we have 9,100,000 characters is about 1,820,000 words. 1,820,000 words. There are 783,137 words in the Bible. I did not count them, someone else did that for me. Because it's the most read book in the world, it provides us with some sense of scope. But when you read a book, you don't tell your friends that you just read an 800,000 word book, right? So the question is, how many pages is 65,000 tweets, or 9,100,000 characters, or 1,820,000 words? Well, if 450 words can fit on a page, that's about 4,044 pages. Just to recall, we have 9,100,000 words, characters, or 1,820,000 words. 450 words per page. That's 65,000 tweets is about 4,044 pages of text. Is that a lot? Well, in this regard, I went to George R. R. Martin for advice. George R. R. Martin, everyone knows the Game of Thrones series. He has 5 books in this series, a Song of Ice and Fire series. The first book is about 694 pages. The second book is about 768 pages. The third book, A Storm of Swords, has 973 pages. The fourth book, apparently Martin must have gotten a little tired because it's only 753 pages. And the fifth book, the last one, he made up for the difference, is about 1,016 pages. So, what do we have? That's 4,204 pages. 65,000 tweets is the equivalent of almost, well, it's a little bit less, than the 5 books that George R. R. Martin wrote over 2 days. To do that requires a serious amount of planning. That's the scope of Russian disinformation about one single event in just 2 days after the downing of MH17. The result? People still doubt the hard evidence that has been presented showing that the Russian military is behind the downing of MH17 to this day. But the narrative has been pushed in the global media that it was an accident or it was a tragic mistake by Russian-backed rebels. Okay, well, let's think about this, right? Jurkiw reveals in a conversation with Surkov on June the 8th, 2014, that he won't last a month if Moscow doesn't provide trained personnel and supplies to stop the Ukrainian advance. This was presented in Amsterdam at the conference where the evidence was presented. It was in fact thanks to the SBU that managed to break the encryption of their conversation. Downing MH17 was not an accident. The evidence strongly suggests it was Russia's intent to shoot down a passenger airliner so as to open a diplomatic and informational front against Ukraine. 65,000 tweets are the equivalent of 5 Game of Thrones books over 2 days with the hashtag Kyiv provocation and Kyiv shot going down. This amount of disinformation has 2 purposes. To erode public trust, to erode trust in public institutions, and to get you, and is designed to get you to trust the lie and doubt the truth. Now, we talk a lot about information war, and we refer very often to Russian disinformation as part of an information war. It's a continuation, it's already been spoken about, of Soviet active measures, and Lysenko and the Stop Fake team have identified at least 18 Russian narratives that are continuously being repeated from nuclear topics, like we even heard earlier today, economic catastrophe that's awaiting Ukraine, neo-Nazis running amok, and that the Maidan was a CIA-directed coup, to the most glaring example of discrimination or even violence directed toward Russian-speaking population in the Donbass. So if we're at war, why aren't we counting, is my question. We used to count nukes during the Cold War. We count the number of tanks that the Russians parked in eastern Ukraine. Recently, the INF Treaty was abandoned. During the Cold War, we counted nukes as a metaphor to represent the concept of the threat and to present the concept of victory. But this is an information war, so let's see who has what. Our partners at EU versus Disinfo, another very valuable resource, broke down the Russian Federation budget, and insofar as state-controlled media are concerned, the Russian disinformation outlets include RT, Первый канал, Zvezda, TASS, Rossiya, Svoboda, and the old Russian state television broadcasting company. Their funding is around $1 billion US. In the United States, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's budget is about $123 million. And it was actually reduced. The U.S. Agency for Global Media oversees RFERL, Voice of America, and a few other agencies, and has a budget of just under $800 million in 2016. These numbers don't include funds from the USAID's Media Development Program in Ukraine, that recently, I think, was around $30 million, was tendered to Internews Network and some others, for example. Oops, wrong one. Now, we also have to consider, in the Russian disinformation scheme, Gazprom State Media Holding, that is one of the largest media holdings after the Russian state media. They have several media assets, including NTV and several other stations, radio, print media, and they're funded by gas dollars, petrol dollars. They have print, radio, online, and you have to also remember that disinformation is evolving. The Internet Research Agency that everyone mentions, the St. Petersburg Troll Factory, is the primary director of influence operations, and it was named in the Senate Intelligence Committee report that just came out, I think it was yesterday, as being very effective at targeting divisions in society. And in the US, it directed its efforts at exacerbating racial tensions. Well, it was renamed the Federal News Agency, and it is also well-funded. The bottom line, Western liberal democracy is losing the information war. Most of the reaction has been to adopt national legislation to curb the effects of disinformation, or to put it differently, to adopt a national digital hygiene strategy. And the Germans have done this. Our partners at Disinfo Portal, another group that's been fighting disinformation, broke down how how the Germans and what the response has been to support and conserve their media ecosystem. And this was motivated by the Lisa case, and if you don't know about it, it was claimed that a Russian-German girl named Lisa was raped by immigrants, and it sparked anti-immigration protests by Russians living in Germany. Well, the reported rape was a fake. But the Germans have adopted what's called a Facebook law, a new cyber command in strategic communications, and other efforts are part of the German response to fake news. But again, they focus on their national hygiene rather than a direct response to Russian disinformation. Ukraine finally has a public broadcaster, Suprun. Its budget is 1.5 billion hryvnia, which is about $61 million. When we look at responses to this information, if we're simply counting how much each side spends, the same way we used to count nukes, the West is losing. Wars need resources and proportional responses. At least that's the conventional wisdom. If we look at the amounts being allocated to state media, Western democracies are not adequately prepared for this information war. And one approach to the information war is to adopt hybrid approaches. But state regulators and licensing agencies have some existing tools at their disposal to address the issue, although they don't have the spine to move forward because of the fear of the backlash that comes with being labeled against free speech. But more needs to be done, and the UK regulator, Ofcom, recently fined RT and provided a stern warning that their licenses may be revoked. There is a project currently under development called the Kyiv Principles. It's being led by Mary Mitsyo, who has several years of experience in media development in Ukraine, both as a journalist and as a lawyer. It was created in response to activities like issues such as hate speech and prohibitions on propaganda war, but of little relevance to the current circumstances and often seem intended to avoid addressing the real issues of hostile Russian propaganda. Journalists from Sofia and other places are part of the project, including several lawyers, to develop more relevant guidelines, to be known as the Kyiv Principles. A group of media experts applied the compendium that's being developed to draft a simple algorithm for defining malicious information. And we hope to have the principles finalized very soon. The issue is, in my opinion, is that we're in a culture war. The national security implications are very serious. For example, one can even point to Russian flyers that appeared in the Donbass all the way back in 2004 that had instructions on how to welcome the Russian army. This was from a source in the SBU, as a lead up to the current invasion. Now that's called the operational preparedness of the environment. So I don't think we're in an information war anymore. It's a culture war. And if you find that a little bit offensive, call it a culture clash, but make no mistake. Russian state media has convinced a large portion of their population that their command or controlled democracy or authoritarianism is an acceptable and safe form of government. Even in the US, students were surveyed by the Brookings Institute in 2017, and they found a systemic misunderstanding of the First Amendment among students in the United States. And some are even okay with authoritarianism. Whereas in Ukraine, an example of this culture war happened very recently. Every year since Russia invaded and occupied Crimea, the YES conference has been held in Kyiv, and a few of you were even in Kyiv during that time. It's sponsored by an oligarch. Now, at the same time, the next leaders of Ukraine held a TEDx conference called TEDx Youth with the theme Celebrate Troubles. My 2 co-picks to this august body is that to look for the next generation and understand their plans, because they will be the ones building Ukraine's future, and I'm really happy to see someone from a hackathon on the dais today. But I mean more bad news. I was at a seminar in London last year, and how our brains react to storytelling, this notion of neuroplasticity, in which subjects were exposed to stories during a functional MRI, and how our brains are essentially hardwired for confirmation bias. And that confirmation bias is one of the main weapons in Russian disinformation arsenal. And only one of the ways that you can fight that is with cultural products. And I'm really happy to see Maria Berlinska here, because she recently produced a film, Nevedimy Batalyon, about women in service. Those are the kinds of media products that are going to win the culture war. The UK has understood this, and by way of example, consider the Royal Television Society. It includes includes both private and public media, and the Minister of Culture. The Minister of Culture has in the past 2 years spoke at their annual meeting. He said, following the Salisbury incident, Russia has begun a blatant disinformation campaign with misleading procedural questions and over 40 different official narratives, all false. Many of these were carried out and promoted on Kremlin-backed media. Russia Today, funded by the Russian state, is a major concern. Ofcom has repeatedly found that RT has been in violation of standards. These include cases when Ofcom say RT's coverage has been labeled materially misleading. Ofcom currently has 10 investigations into the impartiality of RT's news and current affairs program. It was revealing for me, and a very positive sign, that the Minister of Culture is meeting with broadcasters to address the issue of responsibility to the citizens of UK. And I want to leave you with one more word that to me is a confirmation that we're in a culture war. And it was mentioned earlier. And this culture war is RU state-controlled media is waging against Western liberal democracy, but more specifically against Ukraine. And that word is corruption. We heard it here more than a handful of times. As an example of just how effective Russian disinformation has been, over the past few days I've had a chance to hear the word Ukraine mentioned on the news more times than I've probably ever heard it before. And almost always Ukraine is followed by the word corruption, leaving the impression that Ukraine is the most corrupt country in the world, which fits very nicely with the RU narrative of failed state. But the reality is quite the opposite. Despite facing off against the second largest army in the world, the Russian armed forces and their mercenaries and proxies, who are better equipped, better trained, better paid, and whose victory was all but guaranteed, that army was met by volunteer battalions and the combined armed forces of Ukraine, by retired officers from the Special Operations Centers who went back to the front to train them, by civil society that rushed from the Maidan to the front line to provide support. And Ukraine not only stopped the Russian invasion, but also managed to implement one of the most successful reform programs in 28 years. Just tell the truth. Because during times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes that revolutionary act.
Thank you, Marko. That was tremendous.
It was true.
The thing
Go ahead. It might be on the table.
As we take just a minute here to switch, that was a fantastic presentation and I appreciate how in-depth you went into some of the examples. There are two thoughts I have. Earlier today, Adrian Kaniski talked about brand. And this brand, branding is often just about associating words close to each other. What's the word that we can start associating with Ukraine that's not corruption? What words should flow in there easily? Something to think about. How do we get the positive brands to stick? So think about that, and your presentation is up. So, Sofia, the floor is yours. It's delightful to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk about a project that I worked on recently with a team at the University of Pennsylvania at PennApps Hackathon. So we were trying to figure out a way with this disinformation that's happening. There's many different technological ways that disinformation is being spread. And we were specifically looking at a method called deepfakes, in which videos can be altered to make people look like they're saying anything or doing anything. So to illustrate this problem, I'm going to show you a video of Barack Obama, former president, and it seems like he's giving a regular address. But when we look closer, we see that actually an actor called Jordan Peele is overlaying his facial features over Obama's to make him look like he's saying something that he really is not. And we see this across media that is not common specifically to politics and to politicians, but we can see that how this has been proliferating in many different forms of common media. Through movies and famous actors and actresses, this technology has been perfected in a way that companies such as Facebook, companies such as Google are having a very difficult time detecting these, and to also communicate the fact that their users are not seeing legitimate data and legitimate information. Furthermore, this has been an issue internationally as well, with many headlines as recent as January 2019 all the way to Facebook's new challenge that they just put out to try to detect these deepfakes this early October. And the specific issue of this is that advances in artificial intelligence are making these videos more realistic than ever, and therefore we need more creative ways to understand how we combat this form of disinformation. And so one of the solutions that my team had implemented was a Chrome extension that, as the user would watch any video, whether it be on Facebook or hear a YouTube video link, within a few seconds we have a machine learning algorithm working in the background that's filtering the frames of the video, and then will tell the user that this may be a fake video. And so we can see that we have very fast feedback to the user, telling them that any kind of video that they're seeing, whether it be on their daily stream, but within a few seconds before they hit the share button, before they further proliferate any of this data or information, they are notified that this may not be valid information. We further implemented a web app so that if anybody is not sure about a video, they're able to input their link into a box, and then you can see in the background we're reading in frames from this YouTube video and then running our machine learning algorithm on this to determine whether this video is fake or not. And so finally you have these two kind of screens where the user will either see that the video most likely is a deepfake or the video is not. So we know that there's a problem with deepfakes, and looking at the machine learning perspective, we were able to use a support vector machine kernel, which is a supervised machine learning algorithm, and able to get an F1 score of 0.82 with a precision of 1 in detecting these deepfake videos. And specifically, we're utilizing a method that isn't as complicated as many of the Facebook methods have been or the Google methods have been. These are very complex and very difficult algorithms that take a lot of time, with a much simpler kind of algorithm that we're using here. So here we're just looking at the curvature of the different features on the face. Specifically, you saw that there was a difference between videos that were authentic and those that were not. In that videos that were not, it seemed like the facial expressions from the mouth and the eyes were not as diverse or as expressive, and therefore when we look at the curvature of, say, the mouth or the eyes, they would have different values. So they would either be less concavity, so if we look at concavity, they would be less curved in the less authentic videos. And so when we're looking at kind of this disinformation war and how are we going to kind of both look at the cultural aspects, but in this case we're looking also at the technological aspects, what is the future disinformation going to look like? And it seems like not only do we need to give the users faster feedback in order to ensure that they don't proliferate, that for example these tweets don't continue to move through media and through people, and they don't see that this is that they see this issue is an issue very quickly. And additionally, in that as we look at numbers, over the past 7 months there's been over 14,000 of these videos that have been produced. And so if we're trying to detect kind of at least this form of disinformation, we need to realize that we also need to implement technology that is as fast or faster in detecting them. And specifically, it was discussed that we have this form of a culture war as well, in which we need to maybe analyze these videos personally as well, something that's not utilizing technology. But we've seen that in the past, technology has been able to get us this analysis faster. We're able to get data, we're able to get results much more quickly, and therefore I think that we should start to consider this as a possible mechanism. It is a very difficult problem if we're looking at text or any kind of like semantics and understanding of tweets and things like that. It is a very difficult linguistics problem, but I think that we can filter it at least to a basic level where we can produce results more quickly and therefore win the information war. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sofia. That was really interesting. And I appreciate how your team was able to cut down to the core of the issues and the algorithms. So often, the big companies look at they look at trying to get the cutting edge, trying to get all the data, trying to make something complex, and often it's something quick and straightforward. Finding that key. That's fantastic. Appreciate the presentation from our speakers, a very top level kind of bird's eye from Donald, Marko, real dive down, and Sofia sort of hope for the future. May I ask our visitors if someone from the Diplomacy Club or Women Veterans, if one of them would like to take a few minutes and just tell us a little bit about your reactions and your thoughts on this issue as it comes up, if you'd like. And either you're welcome to either come up here or grab a microphone. And we'll have Q&A in just a minute, yeah, but this is in place of Lutko and his initials, so we'll follow up with Q&A after this.
Okay, hello. Thank you for listening to me. For me, it's a little bit exprompt. I didn't prepare to speak today. My name is Olena Maximenko. I represent here Invisible Battalion mission, and I'm Ukrainian military correspondent. Yeah, I served as a volunteer in 2015, and now work as a freelancer correspondent. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about informational war, about situation in Ukraine and abroad. So what does we have? According to the research of IMI, Informational of Institute of Mass Information, there are 75% of Ukrainian channels belongs to oligarchs, and they are not pro-Ukrainian. And you know that most of people, also close to 70% in Ukraine, get information from television. The other one case is the frontline cities near the front line. There is a big problem with Ukrainian channels, because most of people has no possibility to watch Ukrainian channels. At the same time, for instance, in city of Avdiivka, it's on the front line city. People has 32 Russian or so-called DNR channels, and it's a real problem to get information from normal channels, just normal information, because the LG generation of people are sometimes not able to use internet, new technology, and they has no chance to get normal news. And you know, I think better than me that the same situation is on the international level, because Russia has a big experience in making fake news, in making different kinds of informational technology. They has enough money to do it, and what can we do? What our organization does is we represent a documentary movie about women on the front line, about volunteers and soldiers, and also we created such mission as ambassador, veterans diplomacy. So the group of participants of the war travels and present this movie and tell our own stories. So we believe that this is the best way, the best we can do in this situation, because We have no money, we have no technology like our enemy, but we have our experience, we have our truth, and we see that it works. Okay, my sister in Anne will continue.
Hi, my name is Yulia. Olena told a lot, but something that I would like to add is that the absence of Ukrainian mass media in occupied territory, it produced a hateness of local citizens towards Ukrainian at all, and to Ukrainian armed forces, not specific. And when we came, and when we free some territory, and came to the village, for example, or small town, we came there, and the first reaction of civilian citizens who live there is, are you going to eat us? Because one common take that Ukrainian armed forces are eating Russian language babies. Yeah, so and they when we help them, when we feed them and help with the stuff, they look for us quite surprised. They are really surprised that we are peaceful actually, and we are ready to help them. And we produce for them not only clothes and food, but also medical treatment. Usually women there, they are asking us and our medics for help. And now with withdrawal of troops, we don't know how to back that occupied territories with informal. It will take a lot of time and resources.
Thank you. And I think it goes to say that your actions, that people talk about information warfare and forget that what we do is as important or more important than what we say frequently. Let me open the floor. We have just a few minutes before the final session. Will we segue right into it, or do we need a break?
No, we won't have a break.
Just segue into it, great.
So you've got about 5 minutes.
We have a few minutes for questions. I'd like to open up the floor. Patriot.
For those of us who are technically challenged, I'd like to understand the process of producing those 65,000 tweets. Are they pre-programmed? In other words, a few key messages are developed, and then there's some sort of process where you just multiply them? And then the second question, I guess, is we've talked a lot about, and I've talked about, words do matter. And whether it's separatist or whether it's I object to gray zone, because it's not gray, it's red. There's blood being spilled. So is there a system? I know that there are systems like if your name appears somewhere in the news, you get notification. Is there a way to program something where every time somebody uses these wrong words or messages, that there can be an automated response to them?
Question. Why don't we take 3 questions from the floor and then open it up to the panelists? Given my NATO approach here. Please, go back.
Roman Fontana with the Ukrainian American Veterans. I just had a question for Sofia. If there's been any thought to the application of the study of micro-expressions in terms of determining deception with your algorithm. And for Mr. Suprun, I was wondering if you could speak to the fact that a lot of this disinformation, there is a psychosocial, emotional yo-yo that is pushed often onto the masses, and what you perceive if there's an end state to that event.
Great. Other question? I will use my chairmanship and ask one then. Donald, you mentioned about how Putin was kind of going soft on Zelensky. Zelensky is someone who people in Russia know. He was a well-known comic as part of a program, a comedy Olympiad, you could say, at universities, KVN. Does that phenomenon have relevance, do you think, for Russia? And is that the thought in terms of what, Marko, you were saying, is that perhaps part of this cultural war, a response on this cultural war? So let me hand the floor. Who would like to take the floor first? And we go down this straight line.
65,000 tweets. I mean, this is most likely what had transpired is that we're working on a documentary film about this, but to compose the text, a certain portion of the tweets are bots, others are trolls. Normally behind trolls you have real people. But you have to understand that the point of 65,000 tweets over 2 days means the resources, planning, and time and energy went into something like that in order to effectuate a certain end. But the planning doesn't happen without coordination. So the suggestion that I'm making, and I by no means have backed this up with evidence, but based upon what the Joint Investigation Team has produced, that the intent of the Russian response was to shoot down a passenger airliner. Regarding the actual texts, is that it's a combination of both, where there are people involved, servers are monitored, the process is quite complex. And all of that presents itself as a certain masштаб, a certain massiveness to it. Are bots available to manage automated responses? Well, actually, Dmitro Potyakin, who, Alexander Potyakin is his father, he used to be a diplomat here in Washington. He started a small startup. He got funding from Estonia, I think they're called Startup Wise Guys, to develop a plugin for Twitter. Now, frankly, it seems to work quite well in identifying, but the issue for me is that at some point the owners of these platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and other social media are going to have to take responsibility for their platforms. And if they don't self-regulate, then they're faced with looking at government regulation. And I think they'd be interested in self-regulating with peer review or something along the lines of what Sofia is developing to use that technology. That's a different discussion. Psychosocial emotional yo-yo. I didn't quite understand what you mean by that.
Well, what I meant was often this is something I've observed. We had in Iraq, we have information that's pushed out that kind of brings up a level of anxiety,
Oh yeah,
and then it gets driven down.
yes.
So that's designed to actually wear the person out, so that there's an end state push.
In Ukraine it had the effect, there was a great fake of a Spiaty Malchik, the crucified little boy in 2014, that employed actors that was broadcast everywhere. And it's been debunked. I mean, this thing is dead as dead gets, yet I remember, so why I brought up the London conference, because I'm convinced that the Russians were attending this conference way before it even became mainstream, because it's storytelling. And they're using advanced storytelling techniques to understand how their brain works. And confirmation bias is one of those. It's a really, really strong, because our brains are hardwired to do confirmation bias, because it was an evolutionary response, a survival, to maintain our survival as a species. But it didn't necessarily have a yo-yo effect in as much as when that story came out, if you look at the construct, at the very end of the piece, the Russians are coming over terrain as the sort of liberators, because, I mean, let's face it, right? Crucifying a little boy is probably the most horrible thing you could think of, especially in the 21st century. Now, because there's a lack of skepticism in that part of the world, systemic skepticism, that's a problem. So you're likely to believe something as ridiculous as crucifying a little boy. And frankly, people take homeopathic remedies. Who here takes homeopathic medicine? Right? Nobody? Nobody? You do. There you go. 1, thank you. 2, great. Well, you're wasting your money. It doesn't do anything. In fact, there's a skeptic society that has homeopathic suicide day on Trafalgar Square, where everybody gets together and overdoses on homeopathic medicines. And guess what? Nobody dies. Those are predatory tactics that are going after people. So the psychosocial emotional stage isn't necessarily for people getting burnt out by it, in as much as it's designed to effectuate a certain end, which is the belief that Russians are going to be the liberators. And they've been pushing that meme for, 70 years, that Soviet liberation, Soviet occupation is liberation, in fact. And they're going after the Baltics about that, because the Baltics are now pushing this notion that for the last, not notion, the truth, that they've been occupied by the Soviet system. And exactly right, Zelensky is not a new person. And this was very new and very disturbing for us at StopFake, because all the polling that was coming out was asking the question, do you support somebody new? So the pollsters themselves were reinforcing a bit of fake information that Zelensky came out of nowhere, when he did not. Since 2003, he's been the street minister of justice, promoting this line of Ukrainians are idiots, the dumb hutsel, all of this stuff, making fun of Mr. Senor Holodomor, things of these nature that most Ukrainians unfortunately found funny. And that's why it's a cultural issue for me.
Thank you. Donald?
The question was about Russia's assessment of
Zelensky.
Zelensky. Yeah. I think you have to look beyond the fact that he's well known. I mean, Trump was well known enough. But I think there were and are questions about Zelensky and his team that neither we today or the Russians really are sure about. I think one is the obvious one, the relationship between Zelensky, the public figure, and the forces and team around him and who he will assemble is not clear yet. And in fact, who calls decisions on foreign affairs, for example, is not clear. We all know Lysenko here, and he's a very good guy. But who's above him? I think there is somebody. We just don't know. So the Russians are testing him. Number 3 would be that Zelensky has said some really stupid things in the campaign, and I think you never know what's rhetoric and what's really going on. And I think pull back to Steinmeier last week a little bit shows that somebody is getting to him, or maybe he has a good set of advisors. And 4th, I think that the issue of the parliament and the elections is a factor where we don't know the dynamic between the Rada and Zelensky and other oligarchs. So a month ago you were talking about the great free democratically elected Rada. Now we're talking about the dangers of a single party dominating the parliament, which is insulting to Ukraine again, because they think that rule of law and institutions are not that strong. So you have to see how things play out. I think the testing will continue. I think that in the end, maybe 6 months or a year, Zelensky's positions will be relatively where Ukraine has been the last number of years. Although I do think there will be a continuing emphasis on negotiations or Poroshenko. And I think then the Russian rhetoric and hostility will go back to what it was.
Yeah. Thank you. And Sofia, the last 90 seconds here for you.
I'll speak really quickly on the 65,000. So your second question about if we can pick out keywords, that's definitely technology that's out there, and we can also find correlations between different keywords. It's really about like what kind of response are we going to have with that, and what do we do with like misclassifications, because this kind of disinformation is much deeper, and they do it very intentionally, that it's much deeper than any kind of algorithms we have can really tell us 100% of the time that this is fake or this is not fake news. So it's very difficult, and that's kind of what a lot of the technology is working towards, is how can we make it more accurate and more real towards kind of what we're looking for. So it's like a lot of development. And then for the second question regarding microaggressions, microexpressions? I'm sorry, what do you mean by
microexpressions?
Yes.
different studies. The study of microexpressions is based on the fact that the human face cannot actually lie. You can suppress a sign of deception, but you cannot completely, the human face will always express a sign of deception. So the study of microexpressions can be tailored. You could do a video, you could actually target different emotional expressions which express the same way cross-culturally. And I was suggesting to you that may be something to take a look at, because if the individual knows that they are lying, it's identifiable. It's something that I know our government is using in interrogations, so it might be helpful to you.
Yeah, I think thank you, because I think that's definitely a very interesting question, because when you're looking at this is also very similar to the other questions where we're looking for technology that can detect something very minute, or something that we don't have algorithms that directly can detect them yet. It requires some correlations that we need to figure out first. So I think that's a lot of research into, from what I understand, there are probably algorithms right now that can detect these microexpressions. And then so utilizing that within any kind of technology is really just also the communication with the user or whoever is watching the video, or kind of flagging it in some way that this person is lying. So just understanding that, and then also how does this affect the way that people will view the media as a whole, which it should help in that way. So I think hopefully that development continues.
I wanted to add one thing that Nadia brought up about words do matter. And this was very distressing being inside of Ukraine and watching the Western press, including the Atlantic Council, a lot of other very friendly Ukraine publications, wrote about a prisoner exchange. Ukrainians were hostages, not prisoners. The traitors or the collaborators that Ukraine had arrested were prisoners. But all of the Ukrainians currently sitting or then sitting in Russian jails, they are hostages. If you recognize them as prisoners, then you recognize Russia's authority to come into someone's country, arrest them, and try them in a kangaroo court. That's a very, very important, and when Western press gets that wrong, it's really depressing. So talk to your people, if you have them, and get them to understand that Ukrainians were hostages, not prisoners. It's a very, very important distinction. The English language has enough words to have direct meaning, and we need to focus on that.
Thank you. That's a good thought for the way ahead. How to get the words to stick, how to get the right words near Ukraine, how do we build positive brand, and how do we encourage people, journalists, to get it right, which I think most of them want to do. So thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much to our veterans for your contributions.